Hello everybody. Have you ever wondered how consciousness is studied by scientists? Or what is consciousness? Well, let's have a look together. My name is Sinu, and you can call me Sin. It's spelt with an X, not an S. I'm a neuroscience PhD student here at the University of Oxford, and I'm also a doctor training to be a neurologist in the United Kingdom. Welcome to my series called An Oxford Brain Science Talk, where I give my thoughts and discuss some of the many fascinating academic events that happen here at the University of Oxford and around the world in a way that is accessible to anyone who may be interested in the brain and the mind. Find out more about this series in my introduction video. Today, I'm going to talk about consciousness and the science investigating consciousness. These thoughts have really been inspired after attending an interesting series of lectures from the Montreal Artificial Intelligence and Neuroscience Conference, which I was fortunate enough to go to virtually recently. One of the key conference themes was the topic of consciousness, which I've always found really interesting, but also struggled to get a good grasp of. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to discuss the basics and learn more with you. You'll see why I find some things slightly confusing, but I will try to lay them out as plainly as I can. So let's start with my top 3 takeaways. Number 1, the concept of consciousness remains poorly defined, even by the scientific community who studies it. We'll have a look at some definitions and issues around this. Number 2, consciousness research can be approached around 2 main dimensions: the level of consciousness and the content of consciousness. A lot of experiments focus on one of these dimensions. More on this to come. And lastly, consciousness research seems quite difficult to study, but that really makes the research all the more interesting. To see the ways in which scientists have examined consciousness and have to apply scientific rigor to make conclusions based on their findings. So let's get into their main points. Firstly, the field of consciousness is actually relatively young. This has partly been due to how the mind has been perceived till the early 1900s, where behaviorism and psychoanalysis have dominated the cognitive field. As such, behaviorism did not consider the brain as an important cog in the puzzle, whereas psychoanalysis did not consider the internal workings of the mind as interesting as external influences on the mind. Since the mid to late 1900s, however, there have been a rising interest in consciousness. During this time, some very notable Nobel Prize scientists, including Francis Crick of DNA fame, as well as Gerald Edelman, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on the immune system, have turned their attention to the field of consciousness. This has led to an increasing interest up to this day. Apparently, however, before the 1990s, researchers were apprehensive to admit that they were interested in cognitive research, as they were worried what the larger scientific community may think about them. So what is consciousness? Well, to say the definition is still being debated would be a very fair statement. In the introduction talk to consciousness, as well as the panel discussion with experts in the consciousness field, the fact that there was no clear definition of consciousness was repeated several times. I personally think it's pretty incredible that there are these world-class laboratories focused on an area of research in which the consensus definition remains slightly elusive. But this quality may indeed be quite enticing to some scientists as a frontier for exploration. Now, there were some literary descriptions of consciousness given during the talks. For example, one involves the phenomena of falling asleep, whereby consciousness is what abandons us every night as we fall into a dreamless sleep. Now, this is clearly a very metaphorical definition of consciousness. A more objective description, which has some consensus, is that consciousness involves a subjective experience of the world in which it does not lend to a single mechanism. Now, this leads on to what is considered the hard problem of consciousness, described by the philosopher of mind, David Chalmers. The hard problem is, how do we measure this subjective experience or sense of perspective that is only available to the individual who has that experience, as everyone would have a slightly different experience. This is in contrast with the easy problem of consciousness, which really isn't easy at all. But the easy problem refers to how we measure how the brain detects features in the surrounding world. This essentially describes our measurements of brain signals, such as recording brainwave activity using electroencephalography, EEG, or looking at functional brain images. This is easy only in the sense that we have ways of doing this, but actually much of neuroscience research is focused on interpreting these signals that we can measure. Okay, so I think the fact that I've spent such a long time trying to provide a description of what consciousness is should tell you how tricky this field can be. So let's move on to some consciousness research. How is consciousness examined by scientists? Well, in trying to distill many hours of talks, I want to describe two main dimensions that consciousness can be measured along. While there are more and more dimensions being considered, it seems to me that a lot of consciousness research revolves around these two dimensions. These are firstly the level of consciousness, so how awake an individual is. And secondly, the second dimension is the content of consciousness, so what an individual is actually aware about, their depth and richness of their subjective experience of the environment. This is sometimes known as qualia. So we can take a look at how different conscious states would fall onto a graph with these two dimensions of consciousness. I want to go through this quite clearly. The bottom of the graph describes the level of consciousness. So going further to the right means an individual is more awake. On the side of the graph, we have the content of consciousness. So going up means an individual is more aware and has a richer depth and content of experience about their environment. Looking at examples of different conscious states, or consciousness states rather, being fully awake would fall on the top right. For example, after a good night's sleep and your morning coffee, you have a high level of consciousness to your environment and you're ready to experience anything that may come your way. By contrast, being in a coma is often considered the opposite of being fully awake and would fall onto the bottom left. If someone is in a deep coma, their wakefulness or level of consciousness is very low. Similarly, their experience of consciousness is also very low. We don't think people in a deep coma feel much, if anything, at all, although I will expand on this later. Can you think where other conscious states, such as being asleep, would fall on this graph? Why don't you pause the video and have a think? Well, between coma and fully awake, you have intermediate states of consciousness, going from slightly drowsy or sleepy to being in light sleep stages, and then deep sleep stages, and general anesthesia is there just before you get to coma. This is a good thing because if you are having a general anesthetic for a large operation, you neither want to be awake for it or be aware that surgery is happening. There are states which fall out of the diagonal of this graph, and this includes sleepwalking and being in a minimally conscious state. Being in a minimally conscious state describes people who look to be in a coma-like state, but not in that deep, dense coma. Such people can perform simple actions such that an awake person can do, such as open their eyes, drool, or look around the room. However, they won't be able to respond to questions and they don't appear aware of their surroundings. So we can manipulate both dimensions of consciousness, which has been done through research. And examples of this would be putting someone to sleep while they have a general anesthetic, or changing someone's content or experience of their conscious environment by giving them psychedelic drugs. A lot of consciousness research will examine along one of these dimensions. For example, you can measure brainwave activity while someone is having a general anesthetic to see what changes as their consciousness level changes. One fascinating study was done in 2006 by Owen and colleagues. The authors examined a person in a persistent vegetative state, so a coma, and placed them into an fMRI machine, which can take images of the brain, but also give you an idea or a signal of which part of their brain is active. This activity level is based on the blood oxygen levels in different brain areas. What the authors showed was while the patient had a low level of consciousness, effectively unresponsive, the fMRI brain scan showed that they were responding to some of the questions in their mind. For example, when asked to imagine playing tennis or moving around their house, the part of the brain related to such movement, including the supplementary motor area, showed activity. This level of activity was the same as was seen in healthy individuals when asked the same question. This was certainly a remarkable study which has implications on the level of awareness that some coma patients may experience. It also signifies a way of measuring a dimension of consciousness which isn't readily apparent by just observing the individual. Now, it's important to note that this study involved one patient, and there has certainly been a lot of discussion around the design and the validity of the inferences made. But it is a fascinating example of how consciousness can be explored. Moving away from looking at individuals with low levels of consciousness, another important area of research has been to examine conscious awareness of the environment. The term conscious awareness refers to the part of the environment that we are actively aware about, and this may be different from what the brain has actually registered. Let me give you an example. A simple experiment has been to present a stimulus, such as an auditory cue or tone, to individuals at varying strengths. So some tones are loud, while others are softer, and others are very soft. Participants would have to indicate every time they could hear a tone, for example by pressing a button, and signals from their brain are measured throughout the experiment, such as doing brainwave recordings. Scientists have shown that there are clear brainwave signals for these obvious loud tones that participants indicate that they can hear. Interestingly, there are also clear brainwave signals for tones which participants do not register as hearing and may fall just under the auditory threshold for picking up. This suggests that the brain is registering these tones, but the individual is not consciously aware of them. Now, there have been many variations of this approach, as well as confounding factors to think about, including the effects of a button press on our brainwave measurements. However, research has shown that there may be different brain activity signatures for tones which we are consciously aware of compared to tones which we aren't. In addition, it looks like different parts of the brain may be active when we are consciously aware of a tone and when we aren't. This has led to a popular theory of consciousness called the global neuronal workspace theory. In short, this refers to the fact that many areas in the brain are involved in consciousness and that these areas can actually work independently. However, there is then some transformation of these signals to determine what we are actually conscious about. Now, there's a great deal of research and nuance to this theory, and something that I would like to talk further if people are interested. So I'll end the video here by reiterating my top 3 takeaways from trying to introduce consciousness research. Firstly, consciousness remains poorly defined, but that lends to a great deal of interest in the field. Secondly, we can approach consciousness research along 2 main dimensions, which are the content of consciousness and the level of consciousness. And lastly, consciousness research is tricky, but really fascinating. There were many other topics discussed, such as the neural correlates of consciousness, building models of consciousness, and if artificial intelligence could ever gain consciousness, and really many more. And please continue the discussion below with me. So I hope you enjoyed these brief thoughts into consciousness research. Feel free to let me know whether you thought I got anything wrong, or whether you'd like to find out something else about something more specific. In fact, why don't you tell me down below whether you think your computer will ever gain consciousness? Subscribe to learn more about brain science with me, and I shall see you in the next video. Thank you.